They say appearances can be deceiving, but at Luchard, a place where chandeliers cast judgment and menus cost more than apologies, appearances were everything. Elliot Brooks walked in with the kind of posture that didn't demand attention but deserved it. White Oxford shirt, crisp navy slacks, polished loafers. His pin, a small rainbow heart, shimmered faintly near the collarbone. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Yet for some, that tiny detail was all they could see. Before Elliot could even adjust his sleeve, a voice cut through the gilded air like a slap against glass. "Deliveries go around the back." The waiter didn't glance up. His words hit like a reflex, as if Elliot's presence alone had triggered a defense mechanism. Elliot paused, not from confusion, but from disbelief. "I have a reservation," he said softly, as if volume could reduce the tension thickening in the foyer. The waiter scoffed. "Looking like that, this is Luchard, not Olive Garden." Other guests turned. Their smirks weren't subtle. One woman narrowed her eyes at Elliot's pin, leaned closer to her husband. A man in a tailored suit shook his head, then sipped his wine like watching Humiliation unfold was part of the dining experience. Elliot took out his phone to show the confirmation, but before he could tap the screen, a splash of icy water hit his chest. The glass, half full a second ago, now dripped from his shirt like a public verdict. "Your kind usually begs for tips, not tables," the waiter muttered. There were no raised voices, no dramatic exits, just silence, the dangerous kind, the kind that seeps under the skin and stays. Elliot didn't scream. He didn't storm off. He looked the man in the eye and said only 7 words, "You just made a very big mistake." Then he turned, not to leave, but to sit right outside the massive glass window of the restaurant. Rain hadn't fallen yet, but the sky threatened. Elliot didn't check his phone. Didn't fix his soaked shirt. He just sat, eyes steady, watching the door. Inside, laughter resumed. But it was thinner now. Guests looked toward the glass. Some curious, some uncomfortable. Others guilty. But the waiter. He returned to folding napkins as if nothing had happened, as if wiping shame into linens could erase what had been done. Minutes passed. Not many, but enough. Then came the black SUV. It didn't screech, it didn't blare. It simply arrived calm, precise, deliberate, and parked at the entrance like it belonged more than anyone else in that building. Those sitting by the window leaned in. The valet nearly tripped, rushing to open the door, and then she stepped out. Miranda Brooks, the name behind the empire, the architect of Luchard. Every magazine that had ever praised the place did so in her shadow. A woman whose heels never missed a beat and whose silence could cut deeper than words. She didn't smile, didn't wave. Her eyes scanned once, pausing on Elliot's soaked shirt, then turned toward the maitre d'. Inside, unease rippled like a tremor. Elliot hadn't needed to call her. He hadn't said a word, but somehow, she came. He sat still, not smug, not afraid, simply waiting. The waiter who had thrown the water stopped mid-step, his face drained of color as recognition clawed through arrogance. 39 minutes. That's how long it took to go from invisible to undeniable. In places built on image, truth always arrives uninvited. But when it does, it rarely leaves quietly. And sometimes, the most powerful people in the room aren't the ones sitting at the head of the table, but the ones who were told they didn't belong there. If this story speaks to something inside you, something you've buried, or something you're still healing, you're not alone. Follow Heart Story for more stories that honor the dignity you were always meant to carry. Because respect isn't something you earn from a menu, it's something you should never have had to ask for in the first place. The moment Miranda Brooks stepped through the glass doors of Luchard, the air changed. Not dramatically, but decisively. Like a velvet curtain falling after a performance nobody realized was a rehearsal. Her heels clicked in steady rhythm against the marble floor, the only sound that dared to exist as heads turned and silence reigned. She didn't look at the decor, not the gold-frame painting she helped choose, not the menu boards engraved with her initials. She didn't need to. This space was her signature. But her eyes scanned for something else or someone. They landed on Elliot, still seated by the window, still in his soaked shirt, still quiet. A flicker crossed her expression. It wasn't shock. It wasn't pity. It was recognition, sharp and exact. Then her gaze shifted toward the staff, The waiter from earlier stepped back instinctively, his hands suddenly unsure of where to go. The manager, standing near the bar, stiffened. A few patrons leaned away from their tables, sensing something unraveling beyond their understanding. Without a word to Elliot, Miranda addressed the room. "I need the entire management team upstairs. Now." Her voice was calm, unhurried, but it cut deeper than any reprimand. Staff scrambled. Doors opened. The hallway leading to the VIP lounge filled with footsteps muffled by panic. Elliot remained by the window, unmoved. He didn't follow them. He didn't need to. Upstairs, in a room lined with photos from charity galas and Chef of the Year plaques, Miranda stood at the head of a long oak table. She placed a folder in front of her, not thick, but dense with consequence. Inside, detailed logs of customer complaints, copies of anonymous emails, transcripts from staff exit interviews, and security footage, including the very moment a glass of water had been thrown across the chest of the man sitting quietly outside. The room went cold. "You've all read the code of conduct," she said, flipping through the documents without looking up. "But I wonder when was the last time any of you truly understood who this restaurant was meant to serve?" One manager cleared his throat. Another opened his mouth, then closed it again. Miranda didn't wait for answers. "I built this place on precision, on elegance, on service, but somewhere along the way we confused performance with integrity." Then she paused, long enough for her next words to settle like stone. "And I allowed that to happen, because I put this restaurant, this empire, ahead of someone I should have never placed second." A murmur passed between two supervisors. "Elliot isn't here because I called him," Miranda continued. "He didn't ask for my protection. He never has. I've been watching the cameras for weeks. Every time he returned, quietly, without demanding anything, I saw it. I saw him. But I chose to do nothing." The silence was heavier now, not with fear, but with guilt. She stepped back from the table. "This ends today." The meeting wasn't long. There were no threats, no shouting, just consequences and clarity. Downstairs, the atmosphere had shifted again. Guests whispered about the woman who'd arrived in the SUV, about the way the staff had disappeared, about the boy still sitting outside soaked, silent, undeniable. Miranda eventually reappeared, descending the staircase alone. She didn't speak to Elliot, not yet. She didn't need to say anything, not while she was still sorting through what it meant to have chosen silence for so long. But in the quiet space between them, something unspoken passed. Not forgiveness, not yet, but the first crack in a wall that had stood too long. Sometimes, the greatest damage doesn't come from rejection, but from absence, from watching someone you love be hurt and doing nothing. And sometimes, the hardest lesson is realizing that leadership isn't just about guiding others. It's about confronting the ways you failed to protect what mattered most, especially when what mattered was watching you waiting for you behind a rain-soaked window. Long before his name disappeared from the staff registry, long before the gala invitations stopped arriving, Elliot Brooks used to fold napkins in the quietest corner of Luchard. He was small then, no taller than the counter, standing on milk crates just to reach the linen cabinet. He never complained. That corner was his world, a little stage where he learned grace by watching others perform it. His mother, Miranda, was different in those years. Focused, ambitious, brilliant and tired. She would walk past Elliot during service without a word, but sometimes she'd pause, adjust a crease on the tablecloth he'd prepared, then walk away again. Those small gestures were enough, or so Elliot believed. Everything shifted the night he told her the truth. He was 18, nervous, proud. He had brought someone with him, Noah, his first real love, a boy with hands that smelled of rosemary and eyes that never judged. Elliot had waited until the end of the gala, until the guests had finished clapping and the cameras had stopped flashing. He introduced Noah softly, hoping Miranda would smile the way she did when chefs perfected their signature dishes. But her smile never came. Instead, she nodded once, then leaned close and whispered, "Not tonight. The press is everywhere." It wasn't rage, it wasn't rejection, but it was enough to make Elliot understand that his love was not something to be seen. After that, the cracks widened. Miranda stopped asking him to help with holiday events. PR staff began using only her name on interviews. Elliot's image, once scattered across brochures and backstage photographs, faded into the margins, slowly, strategically. He left Luchard quietly, dropped the Brooks name from his email signature, moved to a city where no one knew whose son he was. And he began again. Dishwasher, line cook, prep assistant. It was a climb made from grease and bruised hands. But Elliot never resented the work. He found something sacred in the rhythm of a kitchen untouched by spectacle. In every slice and stir, he reclaimed a version of himself unfiltered by legacy. Noah stayed by his side, not just as a lover, but as a partner in the truest sense. Together, they imagined something new, a space where food and inclusion weren't separate courses. A restaurant where no one had to explain the pin on their collar or lower their voice when saying who they loved. And that's why Elliot returned to Luchard, not for revenge, not to reclaim a throne, but to face the place that had once made him feel small and to introduce Noah, not as a challenge to the past, but as part of a future that refused to stay hidden. He didn't plan a confrontation. He didn't expect reconciliation. He only wanted to walk into the foyer as himself and not be mistaken for someone delivering boxes through the back. But prejudice has a way of clinging to institutions like smoke and velvet curtains. One untrained eye, one unchecked bias. That was all it took to reopen a wound he thought had already scarred. Miranda never knew how often Elliot had driven past the restaurant, how many times he'd hovered near the corner table, watching couples toast anniversaries while he waited for something unspoken to shift. He wasn't angry anymore. He had outgrown that. What remained wasn't bitterness, but a quiet ache for the boy who once folded napkins hoping his mother would see more than just perfect corners. Sometimes, the deepest pain doesn't shout. It doesn't slam doors. It simply walks away and learns to thrive where it's not erased. And sometimes, the most important journey isn't the one that takes you back home, but the one where you learn to walk in, head held high, even if no one calls your name. 1 week after the storm at Luchard, a notice appeared on the staff bulletin board. Mandatory staff training. Time 9:00 a.m. Location main dining hall. Dress code standard uniform. Nobody knew what to expect. Whispers passed between kitchen doors and restroom breaks. Some thought it would be a corporate consultant. Others feared it was a final warning before terminations. But no one anticipated what actually happened. At precisely 9:01, Elliot Brooks walked through the main entrance. Same white Oxford shirt, same navy slacks, same small rainbow pin near the collar. Dry this time, and glowing under the soft morning light pouring through the tall windows. He didn't walk fast, didn't carry slides or handouts. There was no projector humming in the background, just a microphone resting on the host stand and a quiet hush that settled as every eye turned toward him. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't ask for attention. He simply began speaking, and everyone listened. "I started here folding napkins," he said, "right over there in that corner. I was barely tall enough to reach the table edges." A few staff exchanged glances. The room held its breath. I watched my mother build something extraordinary. A restaurant people flew across the country to experience, and I was proud. Not because of the chandeliers or the truffle foam, but because I believed this place stood for something more than image. He paused. Until one day, he didn't need to name the waiter. He didn't need to replay the moment water hit fabric. Everyone in that room had seen the footage, but this wasn't about that moment anymore. It was about everything underneath it. Elliot turned toward the back of the room. The server who had confronted him sat near the aisle, hands clasped tightly, shoulders curved inward. Elliot walked slowly toward him, not accusing, not towering, just present. "You didn't just throw water at me," Elliot said. "You threw it at the boy who once spent every Saturday morning wiping fingerprints off silverware in hopes someone might notice." The server looked up, not with fear, but with something quieter, something harder to hide: shame. "But I'm not here to shame anyone," Elliot continued, "because shame doesn't teach, it only silences." Then he looked around. "I'm here because this place is still my home. And home, when it's broken, needs more than apologies. It needs truth. It needs change." Near the back, Miranda sat quietly. No announcement had been made of her presence, no spotlight shone. But she was there, in the last row, dressed in charcoal gray. Her posture formal, but her eyes damp. She didn't interrupt. She didn't defend. She simply watched the way a mother might watch a child walk alone for the first time. Knowing the distance wasn't just measured in steps. Elliot didn't cry. His voice didn't crack. But something in the room did. He closed by inviting staff to ask themselves a question not about policies or rules, but about people. When someone walks through that door, what story are you assuming? And more importantly, what story are you willing to learn instead? The room didn't erupt in applause. There was no performance to celebrate, just silence. And in that silence, something began to shift, not loudly, but deeply. As people stood and began to leave, the server remained seated. Elliot didn't move either. There was no need to. A nod was exchanged, barely perceptible, but enough to say, "I see you now." Behind them, Miranda remained seated, her hands resting gently in her lap. For the first time in years, she looked at her son not as a brand, not as a legacy, but as a man who had chosen truth over bitterness and presence over power. Sometimes, leadership doesn't come from above a podium or behind a title. Sometimes, it stands barefoot in the middle of a room, wrapped in the very fabric it was once soaked in, and says, "This is who I am. I'm still standing. And I still believe we can do better." The day Louchard reopened after its internal reform, the street outside was unusually quiet. No press, no ribbon cutting. Just a new brass plaque mounted beside the door, polished. Simple. It read, "We don't just serve food, we serve dignity." Inside, the dining room had barely changed. The same golden lighting, the same velvet booths. But the energy was different. Like the space had finally exhaled after holding its breath for far too long. At precisely noon, Elliot Brooks entered through the front doors. No hesitation, no waiting by the window. He wore a soft gray suit, tailored perfectly to his frame. The collar open, no tie. On his lapel, the rainbow pin gleamed as if it belonged because now it did. Noah walked beside him, holding his hand, calm, composed, quietly radiant. Together, they moved with the grace of people who had walked through fire and come out with their integrity intact. Staff stood in 2 rows near the reception desk. This time, no one assumed, no one whispered, no one turned away. As Elliot passed, each employee offered a small bow, not just of protocol, but of recognition. "Welcome back, Director Brooks," one whispered. Elliot nodded softly, not with pride, but with peace. Miranda stood near the fireplace, wearing black slacks and a cream blouse. Her hair pulled back, her hands folded, but her expression softer than ever before. When she spoke to the guests gathered for the relaunch, her voice was steady, but something in her eyes betrayed the weight of what it took to stand there. "I founded Louchard with precision in mind," she began. "But over the years, I forgot that excellence without inclusion is just performance." She turned toward Elliot. "Today, I name my son, Elliot Brooks, as the rightful heir and leader of Louchard, not because of his name, not because of mine, but because he reminded this place what real integrity looks like." There was no applause. Not yet. Only the quiet nods of those who had witnessed the journey unfold. Noah stepped forward and unveiled a small banner draped over a side wall. Behind it was the logo of a new foundation, a vocational training program for LGBTQ plus youth and at-risk teens pursuing careers in hospitality. Elliot spoke briefly about the program, about giving opportunity not just to those who fit in, but to those who had been told they never would. It wasn't a speech rehearsed, just truth, shared with calm conviction. The first donation had already come in from Louchard's own profits. Later that evening, as guests dined and staff moved effortlessly through the room, Elliot stepped outside for a moment. The air was crisp, familiar. He looked back at the building. The windows no longer reflected a version of himself that needed to shrink. Miranda joined him a few minutes later. No ceremony, no apology, just presence. She placed her hand gently on his arm. Then, without looking at him, she said, "This time, you don't have to stand in the kitchen. You stand at the center, where you always should have been." He didn't answer, but the silence between them said enough. Inside, someone raised a glass. Laughter rose. Not nervous, not guarded, just real. Sometimes, the battle isn't about tearing something down. It's about standing in the same place that once tried to erase you and turning it into proof that you were always worth seeing. And sometimes, healing isn't loud. It arrives when dignity walks through the door, hand in hand with love, and finally gets a seat at the table. What's one moment in your life when you knew you deserved better? Share it below. Your voice might be the reason someone else finds theirs. If this story moved you, follow Heart Story for more powerful, healing stories that celebrate courage, identity, and quiet revolutions.